You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes, we are going to be talking about Disney Who, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
And I'm John.
And so, yeah, we're not done news in the Doctor Who sense on the podcast for a little while, and we're both a bit behind the times because I've been exceptionally busy at work, and so busy, in fact, I'm going to be slurring all over this podcast, I think. But there has been an absolute plethora of news since the sort of I was going to say anniversary special, then the centenary special was on, and of course this week Doctor Who magazine came out too with even more news in it. So as we, the two of us, had a spare night tonight because nobody else was available, instead of doing a review from which we would have had to exclude somebody, I suggested instead that we do a podcast on a sort of news roundup sense. So the first question, I suppose, the first order of business is Disney Plus. This is news that's a couple of weeks old, but we've not had a chance to mention it. This, I'm assuming, because this had kind of escaped a few weeks earlier anyway, I'm assuming this was kind of old news and not a surprise to anybody. Is that right, John?
I would say so. Yeah, it's so 3 weeks ago. It said Disney Plus has the distribution deal for everywhere outside the UK, which is, I believe, bad news for people in Australia in particular, because Who will no longer be free to air over there. So
Yeah.
immense sympathy with everyone in Down Under.
Yeah, that's actually true, and that's a bit sad. But I guess that's kind of a small casualty in terms of the bigger picture. I don't know. It's not very nice, clearly.
No.
But it's one of those things where if you're going to put a deal like this together, this deal was going to be for everywhere outside the UK, and they weren't going to start doing patchwork with it once Disney Plus were involved, because Disney Plus is either you're in or you're out, really, I suppose.
Yeah.
One of the things that came up afterwards, because of course we're not talking about the news as it happened, but we got the benefit of a bit of hindsight now. But one of the things that came up afterwards was a conversation about how much money might get put in because of the Disney deal. And, you know, there was, I think it was Broadcast, which is sort of like the sort of trade newspaper or trade online paper, which is, I suppose, where people would have read it. But I think Broadcast's a print publication as well.
Still, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So they were bandying around a figure of $100 million or £100 million for a season at Disney Plus. Thing is, though, the Disney Plus thing is a distribution deal. So the Broadcast article didn't come out of nowhere. They were talking about money that they could see being put into the series. And I don't think that was entirely speculation, because papers like Broadcast don't tend to just put out entirely speculative articles without at least a little bit of a nod and a wink behind the scenes from somebody. So the question I've got to ask here is, do we actually expect there to be a lot of extra money from the Disney Plus deal, given that it is still being made, well, for the BBC, and Disney Plus at the moment presumably aren't going to have any kind of artistic control over the series? It's just going to be, I mean, clearly Disney Plus might make suggestions and things, but as things stand, I'm not entirely sure how much, you know, Bad Wolf and or the BBC stock would have to put in those suggestions, whether they'd have to take them on the chin or whether they'd be able to say no. I don't know. What's your feeling about this?
I mean, my feeling about it would be that any sort of creative input would be limited to the edit they would carry on their channels. You know, they would probably have the right to veto certain stuff that they don't find suitable, perhaps. But I can't see Russell T Davies giving up creative control, because that's not his mindset. I mean, the
And on
question
that
that
subject of, you know, unsuitable material, I really can't see that happening anyway.
no,
Because Doctor Who's kind of PG
it's a
stroke
TV.
12A.
It's Saturday night telly. It
Whereas, you
shouldn't
know,
happen.
Disney Plus now are carrying things like Andor, which is definitely going slightly more grown up.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I can't see Disney Plus. In fact, that's the good thing about this deal, is that Doctor Who absolutely fits right in the middle of that strata between Marvel and Star Wars, and you could see there being like a little Doctor Who hub with a button on the main page, if and when they managed to get some more of that back catalogue up on there, because at the moment they just got the episodes going forwards.
Yeah. I don't know if this £100 million they're saying, is it just going to be spread over a season, or is it going to be there for maybe this alleged Doctor Who universe, these the spin-offs that Russell wants to do?
Yeah.
So we don't know where the budget's going. That's the key.
No, exactly. And we don't know if that, well, we don't know if that's extra budget. We don't know if Disney Plus want to maybe take over the budget to all intents and purposes. Presumably not. But I mean, this article is kind of a strange one. I thought so. Kind of a strange one. Do we think, because there's a lot of pushback on this. Here's one of the things that I've heard pushback about. I don't like Disney Plus. Somebody said, and this, I'm not going to say the name, but it was on my Twitter feed, so it wasn't exactly private. So I don't feel that I shouldn't mention it at all, but I won't say the name. Somebody was saying when they were a kid, they were on something that was, I don't know if it was made by Disney or that Disney had some after the fact sort of input on, because it was maybe a documentary of some kind that these kids were featured in. I think he said he was 16. I think he said he had to sign an NDA, and I think he said, I think he said the basic gist of it was that he was uncomfortable with that situation. And that is a fair point. Disney Plus have not had over the years the best of reputations, but I think there is a relatively simple answer to that. And that is that the people who ran Disney then are not the people who are running Disney now. And I think any corporation probably changes along with its sort of management staff. And I think there are a lot of women in sort of top roles at Disney these days. And I would imagine that Disney as an organization is very different from the Disney of 20 or 30 years ago, especially sort of 1980s, 1990s, when Disney was struggling. And I think during that period, they probably did some questionable things to try and claw back some of their sort of market superiority. Whereas these days, they don't need to, because they are the superior force in the market. And I think that allows them, I don't know, maybe I sound a bit naive saying this, I think that market superiority probably allows them a little bit of magnanimity in terms of how they treat people. I would certainly hope so.
Yeah. Well, I think the rooms I had mainly concern the effects houses, because obviously much of the business of Hollywood with effects work is Disney. Related one way or the other, they don't, they don't give them much time to do their stuff. So,
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay.
so I think, but this, I don't know how much of that is part of making the TV, how much deadline slip, how much they need to hit certain, certain release dates or anything like that. I mean,
Andor got put back by a month, didn't it? I wonder if that was an effects thing.
That's a good question.
Because it
Yeah,
was due in August, and then in August they said actually it'll be turning up in September.
but I think as well, NDAs are pretty standard in the television industry these days.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't want
when
to
I did
harp on too much about this fella,
no,
because
not at
that
all. But
was
I say when I did Game of Thrones back in 2018, I had to sign an NDA as well for that. So
oh,
I,
right,
I
yes.
suspect if you work as an extra or a casual on a production, they're going to have that because they don't want the news and information leaking.
His question, of course, the reason why he found it questionable was because he was still a kid, a
Yes,
16-year-old.
it
So
would need to be signed by a parent or guardian, really.
yeah, absolutely. But Disney Plus on the whole, do you think that's a positive, or do you think that's a minus? And you can include the question of Australia in your answer, I suppose, because I mean, genuinely, that's not a very nice situation for them, because not all of those people will want to. I suppose there are other means.
Yeah, Australia, I think, is the big casualty on this, because they've been getting Doctor Who free to air almost since it started,
Yeah, pretty
much.
much. Yeah.
And now it's going to be, if they want it, they're going to have to go and hunt for it. I think it's going to be to the detriment of Doctor Who in Australia, but in America, I think it's the biggest streaming platform now, isn't it? Or not far off it. So you've got
Oh, I should imagine so. Yeah.
and if you can get Doctor Who on the front page of that, and people might be intrigued by it, it can only raise the series profile in America. Even it's not small over there, but it's not a huge show. So
hitherto, Doctor Who's main platform up until relatively recently was always BBC America.
yeah,
BBC America is not only you pay for the platform, but actually it was on the second tier of the platform, so you had to pay twice for
it's a
Disney
double.
Plus.
Yeah,
A bit like on Amazon Prime, there are other things on Amazon Prime that you can pay for as an extra to Amazon Prime. So to watch BBC, to watch Doctor Who in America, by and large, you had to pay twice a month for it.
yeah,
And that was never going to bring Doctor Who a massive audience. So in a country of 270, 280 million people,
somewhere in that. Yeah,
even at its height, Doctor Who was getting, I think, just under 1 million viewers. And then, of course, it had been on streamers, so it spent a little while on Netflix.
yes,
Currently on, not AMC, the other one, HBO Max. And in between, it was somewhere else as well. I suspect that it probably gets more business on the streamers now than it does on BBC America, because by the very nature of it, people are probably already paying for some of those streamers anyway. But even if they're not, you only have to pay once for the streamer rather than twice for BBC America. So Doctor Who's viewing figures in America have gone from like 900,000 to about 300,000. But I should imagine that shortfall is probably more than made up for by like HBO Max or whatever. But Disney Plus is going to take that to another level again. In fact, if it takes it to Star Wars levels, you'd be talking about maybe a couple of million people rather than sort of like 500,000 to 1 million people. So yes, but also Disney Plus takes it to 150 other countries around the world where Disney Plus is, streaming into. And that is, even at its height, the Day of the Doctor went to 97 countries. And
yeah,
and I suspect that number shrunk rather than grown in the intervening years, perhaps not by much, but I can't imagine it's grown in the intervening years. I expect some of those countries will have taken it out of curiosity and not sort of carried on with the deal. So I imagine the Disney Plus deal is going to take Doctor Who to roughly twice as many countries as it is currently available in. So that's certainly got to be said in its favour.
yeah, and I think it just makes sense from Disney's point of view as well, because you've got 3 of the world's biggest sci-fi franchises straight there.
Exactly, yeah.
Plus, they've got, I think they've definitely got the X-Files. I think they've got Buffy there as well, off the top of my head.
Could well do. They've got all the Fox stuff, so whatever was on Fox would be on Disney. And of course, a lot of other stuff as well on top of that. And of course, they've been buying in. So, because one of the things about the Doctor Who deal is there's this big sort of thing about, well, Disney make all their own stuff that's on there at the moment, and Doctor Who will be, basically the first thing that's on Disney Plus that Disney don't make themselves, that they're just buying the rights to show. But actually, while that's true of the sort of front end catalogue on Disney Plus, the back end catalogue on Disney Plus is very different. There's a lot of stuff brought in from all different sources because Disney have wanted to sort of centralize the Marvel back catalogue. So, for example, they've had to buy in lots of series from lots of different places so they can collect them all together under the Disney Plus Marvel banner. So the back end on Disney Plus is actually rather different from the front end. And hopefully Doctor Who will be front end. You can't imagine it not being. But yeah, it's not like there's not precedent for Disney, streaming material that wasn't made by them. And this kind of possibly becomes a bit of an experiment for them. Did you hear the quote today from somebody fairly senior at Disney about?
I haven't yet. No.
Okay, I don't have it in front of me, and I can't remember exactly what it was. So I'll try and give you the gist of it as accurately as I can. The conversation was about Disney Plus and its investors, and I think this was a quote that went out to program makers or maybe program commissioners, talking about the fact that Disney Plus, as of yet, is not into profit. So despite having, I don't know, 150, 200 million subscribers worldwide, which at roughly $10 a head brings in $2 billion a month or something. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just doing the maths off the top of my head. But it's a crazy amount of money is coming in. But they're also spending a crazy amount of money on making programming. And so there was a quote that sort of landed on social media about not so much tightening belts as just being slightly careful, I think. And I suspect that one or two people might have worried about the Doctor Who deal because it's just been announced and now it might be a casualty of Disney having to be a bit more careful. Apparently they expect to go into profit at some point during 2024. So that's still like maybe 2 years away, a year to 2 years away. Yeah, sure. But I think they wouldn't have announced this now. And this deal will have been on the cards for several months. But this deal doesn't actually kick in until this time next year. And the fact that they've announced it now, it would be extremely unlikely for them to announce a brand new exciting venture only for that to immediately become a casualty of something that's actually predated back to before where this deal took place, because presumably, you know, this executive at Disney is mostly talking about programming that's been in place for a couple of years rather than stuff that's just coming up. And he's talking about being more careful going forwards because of the mistakes, for want of a better word to call them, that they've made in the past since Disney Plus first happened. So there are slight worries and a slight sort of idea of a wobble, but I think Doctor Who's pretty safe.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to announce this unless the contracts have all been signed. So
For sure.
Exactly. So I think it will cost them an absolute ton to get out of. So I don't see it affecting Doctor. People on social media will worry because that's what fans do and what fans have done since time immemorial.
Yeah.
But I just don't see that happening.
Plus, of course, Disney Plus just put out that. I think it was Disney Plus put out the video of Ncuti Gatwa, a 2-minute video of him explaining what Doctor Who is for people who won't know.
Oh, so, yeah, that was lovely as well.
It was. I actually haven't seen that. I meant to get around to watching that before we did this, and it completely slipped my mind.
Oh, it's the energy of him. I absolutely love the energy of his performance again. I think we're in for a golden era on that front if there's anything to go by.
I tell you what will be slightly odd is the fact that they're going to do the 3 Tennant very backwards looking 60th anniversary specials before you get to Ncuti Gatwa, and those 3 specials will be the first thing that lands on Disney Plus, which is a bit of an odd way to announce yourself.
I think it's kind of making the most of an availability crunch, because obviously I think Ncuti Gatwa was filming the Barbie movie, so you had.
Well, no, that's not the reason, is it?
No, I know as well, but because I believe it was Tennant and Tate got in touch with Russell and went, "Why aren't we doing this again?
Yeah.
Let's go and do it. Let's go and have some fun." And then,
well, yeah, we'll get into that in a minute. Yeah. Okay, well, let's get into that. No, before we get into that, let's talk about the logo. Do you like the logo?
Yeah, I do like the logo. Obviously, it's based on one of the all-time classics, the one that everyone loves, but seeing it on all the merchandise now, it's really it does pop at you. I think the blue.
Well, I'll tell you what pops at you is the word "who." I tell you what doesn't pop at you is the word doctor.
Yeah,
I think that's a fatal mistake. I think it makes it look awful. I would like it if the Doctor popped as much as the Who.
Yeah, that I don't know if that's a design thing, if they'll correct that now, but
I don't know. It's obviously deliberate.
Yeah.
But it feels like a really weird error. Do you think? Because my initial assumption was diamond logo for the diamond anniversary, something deliberately backward looking for the next 3 episodes, and then they'll go with the actual new logo from the beginning of Ncuti Gatwa. Of course, Disney Plus thing maybe puts a spanner in that suggestion. I don't know. I would say people are saying, "Oh, you don't spend all that money on a design for a new logo and importing it onto all your sort of merchandise and everything else, only to change it after 12 months." But I would counter that with, in this day and age, it doesn't actually take that much to replace a logo on a magazine cover or on a sort of a computer app, a mobile phone app or whatever. Disney Plus, if they did have a hub for Doctor Who, what would it take to replace the logo on that hub? Not a great deal.
But it fits perfect. It fits perfectly on that sort of Disney Plus front screen with the little square screens. So it would be ideal.
It does, yeah. Plus, of course, the other thing about that sort of Disney front screen with all the various hubs is that they've all got old logos, essentially. The Disney logo is God knows how old. I don't know if there's a Fox logo there, but certainly the Marvel logo has been around for a long time. And the Star Wars one's 50 years old.
Yeah.
Or for whatever it is, 45 years old, yeah. So they're all old logos. So kind of this logo fits in with a theme of timeless logos, because this is the logo I suspect that most people associate with classic Doctor Who. It was the Tom Baker logo. So if you're thinking of Doctor Who and you're thinking the guy with the scarf and the robot dog, this is also the logo you'd have in mind.
Yeah, it was on so much when the old series pretty much had its peak of merchandising under Tom. It's the one that you saw in the stores when you knew. Much as I'm happy with the neon logo and that, they never had that same impact. And even the Pertwee logo really didn't make that much of an impact, because it's quite a sort of simple design, which doesn't really, again, poppy. That one, it has a distinctive shape to it. It's a silhouette there.
I had two badges with Doctor Who on, which I bought in the 1980s, and both of them had the diamond logo on.
Yeah, and again, it's how many of my the Target books, if you have a look at them, many of them were.
The only thing that I think mitigates against this being I seem to have that word in my head tonight, but against this being the ongoing logo for Ncuti Gatwa and onwards, is I think because it is the diamond logo, just given basically a bit of a wash. So going back to what I said about, it will have cost all this amount of money to put together and lots of thinking and all this kind of stuff. No, it's the diamond logo given a slightly modern feel with a bit of 3D in there, but it is the diamond logo. It's, the diamond logo exactly, more or less.
I might be misremembering, but didn't they have the diamond logo partly for the 30th anniversary as well?
I think you're right.
I'm trying to remember, because I'm trying to remember on the back of the New Adventures. So yeah.
And the 30th anniversary, somebody said, you can't do a logo for a year for an anniversary. And I'm thinking, well, they did it on the 30th.
Yeah, because it had
so there is precedent. Yeah. And back in those days, it wasn't just as easy as it is now to switch out a logo. 2 clicks on a mouse on a computer and you switched out your logo. I've been slightly disingenuous there, but you know what I mean. It's a lot easier to change these things now than it was 20 years ago. And I wonder if, because let's face it, Russell T Davies, there is a lot of ego there. Russell T Davies is the big, marvellous Russell T Davies.
He's not a shy man, let's face it.
He's not a shy man, and he's driven to a certain extent by ego. How much is he going to want his second time on Doctor Who to be associated with an old logo rather than a new one? I just wonder if that's the kind of thing that would niggle at him. I don't know, but
then again, you're talking that logo is what did it change? 40 odd years ago, over 40 years ago now. So who, of the modern audience, no one's going to really associate that logo with Doctor Who, of that's come along since, particularly on modern.
Well, no,
it's come along since 2005.
Oh, sure, but fans will, and that's kind of the point, I think, because he knows. So I wonder. So I think it's still 50-50 over whether this is a temporary logo or a permanent one. Because let's face it, it's a diamond logo for the diamond anniversary.
Absolutely, that was my thought.
So the question is not, is that what they intended, but is that what they intend to replace? So I think it's still 50-50 on that. Let's talk about some other things. So I've got a list of single words that I've got written down, and I've written them down in a completely random order. So I'm just going to bring them up.
Word
randomly.
Association, I like it.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to word associate. I'm just going to. So some of these are from Doctor Who magazine, and some of these are from. Actually, most of them are brought up in Doctor Who magazine, because Doctor Who magazine's got a pretty comprehensive guide to everything that's happened in the last sort of 2 weeks or so, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, Philip Sims is the new production designer. Did you pick that up? I
did. I have no idea.
Right, there was about 5 pages. Was it 3 pages or 5?
I think
maybe it was 3.
3 or 4, where just they ask everyone about when they saw
But,
who
but it's
first.
basically a list of the new staff. What
Yeah.
I notice isn't in there is who the music is going to be. So there's no
Yes,
mention of Murray Gold yet.
there have been a lot of assumptions about that I've seen, but I
Well,
wouldn't be
Russell
too.
T Davies has never worked with anybody else in the last 20 years, I think. I could be wrong, but certainly since Doctor Who, he's never worked with anybody else. And I think going back before Doctor Who, I don't think he used anybody else for at least 5 years. Probably the Grand was the last time he had a. No, in fact, even the Grand might have been Murray Gold. Point being, he's a composer that is indelibly associated with Russell T Davies. And it's not just that there's an association, it's that there's a friendship and a collaboration. So I would be very surprised if it wasn't Murray Gold.
Yeah, I mean, it suits Russell's brand of Doctor Who particularly because obviously Russell likes the
Yeah,
heightened emotion, and that's what Murray Gold composes to. So he knows what he's going to get from Murray Gold. It's absolutely perfect. I mean, if I had to put money down, I would lay money that Murray Gold will be the composer, but I
yes,
will
for
not
sure.
be surprised either way.
Yeah, it's not impossible that he'd pick someone else. Going back to the subject of Philip Sims, now this is interesting. Quite a few of the things he's done recently have been with Disney. So that's like, so is it just coincidence that this production designer who's done a lot of work with Disney is now on Doctor Who? Or is that actually something that happened because of the deal? Or is that something that happened and then that's what put the idea of a deal into people's heads? Interesting.
Is hang on, is Philip Sims based around the Cardiff area? Because
I don't know.
it might simply be what's filming around Cardiff right now. Around the South Wales area.
Could be. Let's have a look. It's. I think it mentioned like not the Last Jedi. I think it mentioned Return of the no Revenge of the Sith. In fact, I don't think it says Revenge of the Sith. It just says Star Wars Episode 9, Guardians of the Galaxy, Age of Ultron, and a
Black
couple of
Mirror.
Mission Impossible and a
Yeah.
couple of Mission Impossible films. But I can't
Well,
imagine that Guardians of the Galaxy and Age of Ultron were sort of Cardiff centric.
no, this kind of comes back to me. It was something I saw on Twitter the other day, and I was talking about with Matt and others. It's not this Disney deal. The extra money is not simply about what extra special effects you get on stage. What more you spend. It's the personnel you can attract with the money, with the quality you can get in. And Philip
Yes.
Sims suggests, as a production designer with his background, it's cinematic experience for the most part there, and much higher budgets than we used to on Doctor Who. So it suggests to me they are looking to go really, really big on the look of the show, at least.
It feels that way, and that certainly feeds into that suggestion too. So that is an interesting one, and clearly, obviously, there's no answer to that. But I do think that throws up a few questions, and that's quite an interesting one. Let's talk about the new companion. So I've heard. So there was a little bit of back and forth on, I think, Gallifrey base or social media somewhere about whether oh my god, now I should Yasmin Finney.
Yasmin Finney,
Yeah,
yes,
Yasmin Finney. Whether she'd be staying on beyond the three specials. I don't think it was. I certainly didn't get the impression that she would be, but it is confirmed in the new edition of Doctor Who magazine in Scott Hancock's production note thing, production diary.
Sorry,
So now
yes.
we're going to have a production notes and a production diary. But Scott Hancock, who I used to know slightly from when he was doing the Dorian Gray things, and what a lovely fella. So congratulations to him. I don't know if he's
Absolutely.
listening. You'll be welcome on for Desert Planet Picks anytime. Yes, because I used to review all the Dorian Grays and they were excellent. So yeah, he's a very good person to have around. In his production diary, he mentions about casting call for a new companion. So that confirms that Ncuti Gatwa will have a companion other than Yasmin Finney. Because I think
people were tracing it to a picture, something on Russell's Instagram, like a end of September time thing.
oh yes, I don't know, but it is given a date in here.
So something 25th-ish. I've only flicked through Instagram because it only came through my door this morning and I was out. So
Saturday the 24th, secret companion
oh,
auditions taking place in London with Ncuti Gatwa in attendance.
interesting.
So
Yeah,
there you go.
I think Yasmin Finney is an absolute great statement to have. Isn't she in Heartstopper? I think wasn't she? Is it Heartstopper?
I don't know, could be.
I can't. But yeah, it's obviously the kind of statement that the show wants to make. Again, Russell T Davies being a very queer friendly version of the show, and absolutely it's a good thing to see representation like that on screen. I'll be fascinated to see what the dynamic for the new companion is, because I think Russell said he's got different things he can work with now. So I'm thinking he might be aiming for something slightly different to the usual Doctor, and not quite apprentice figure, but that kind of thing. He might try and change that dynamic up, I wonder.
Somebody I saw suggested an actor who I don't know, actress, female actor, who I don't know, from some program, and I just very quickly Googled the person, and what came up were lots of pictures of a sort of slightly petite, very blonde, very blonde, very white, as in sort of very pale as well,
Yeah.
actor. And actually, let me tell you a story about when Christopher Eccleston was announced. Not really a story, but just a sort of slightly anecdote. So when Eccleston was announced, there were lots of people saying, well, who's the companion going to be? And they were all naming names that were of an ilk with Eccleston.
Yes,
Somebody who would, and it was all sort of like, for want of a better description, RSC actresses and stuff like this. And then when Billie Piper was announced, I was like, yeah, of course. You want somebody who is absolutely the utter opposite, because that's how you get drama and character and personality out of the TARDIS crew. And so when I saw these pictures of this girl with this really white hair and this really white face, and you sort of mentally put them next to Ncuti Gatwa, I'm like, yeah, okay, so you are going basically back to a sort of Rose stereotype. But what you are doing is doing something that, again, is completely and utterly the opposite. So I could really see that working. So I wouldn't be surprised if they went with something totally different, like as you're saying. But then again, I wouldn't be surprised if they went with something totally very much like Billie Piper and Rose, because again, I think that would work really well with Ncuti Gatwa.
Absolutely. I think that, again, the key for it, again, it's the same thing with Ncuti Gatwa. I think they were saying the companion, you're looking for someone who's not big yet, not a star yet, but has that potential. Because Billie Piper, absolute star. Karen Gillan had gone to Hollywood. Jenna Coleman, prestige dramas all the way down. You want that kind of person who's going to just on the verge and could go on to that and see Doctor Who, as a job for a couple of years, and then a stepping stone to a bigger part of their career. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship,
Right, let's talk about some sort of behind the scenes things that are to do with sort of episodes and all this kind of stuff. They've said that the 3 specials will go out in November. There's going to be nothing before November. We said this on our review, but people might not have heard that, and it was late in the episode, so people might not have registered. And there are definitely people who haven't got this message yet, because I saw somebody either earlier today or maybe late yesterday talking about whether there might be a special this Christmas or early next year. And we were all having to say, no, they've said they're going to be in November. So the 3 specials are going to be in November. Now, they could be on 3 consecutive weekends. And who knows whether it'll be the first one on or near the anniversary or the last one on or near the anniversary. But I made a suggestion ages ago, which I reiterated on our review podcast. And I think that what it says in the magazine about who has recorded what perhaps feeds into this slightly. So I think this kind of slightly reinforces what I said. But my suggestion was that you would have the first special on Thursday, the 23rd of November, on the anniversary itself, a second special the following night on the Friday, and there's another reason for that, which I'll come back to, and the third special on the Saturday. So the sort of little tiny mini series of David Tennant finishes on Saturday, which, even in Russell's mind now, is probably still the traditional time for Doctor Who. So you run from the anniversary to a Saturday, and you sort of cover all those bases. And very briefly, the other base that I think you cover there is you trial Friday nights, because to me it makes sense for Doctor Who to move to Friday nights, because people stream way more than they watch live these days, And to me, it makes sense to have Doctor Who on right at the very start of the weekend, which gives people 48 hours away from school or work to find time to stream it. Because I think one of the reasons why the viewing figures have gone down so quickly in the last couple of years is because on a Sunday night, you've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday before you're back to the weekend. And people's minds have moved on. So people who didn't see Doctor Who on a Sunday are probably thinking, oh, I'll catch up with that. But by the time you get to next Friday, there's, 2 or 3 other things that have appeared on Disney Plus, and you just don't get around to it. I think by doing it on a Friday, you give people 48 hours to get around to it before they're back to school or work.
Absolutely. And the other thing, you see, since the pandemic and, 20 years ago, the case for not being on Friday is pretty obvious because they're looking for an audience. And people still went out on a Friday night a lot. I don't think people go out as much on a Friday night, particularly since the pandemic, anymore.
But also, Doctor Who's not exactly aimed at people who go out at the weekend.
Well,
really.
Russell wants a young audience, an engaged audience, doesn't he, as well? So I think that will be a kind of factor because Russell does very much think in terms of.
But also, John, I don't know.
The audience. Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware, but going out in the years since we used to do it has changed considerably.
Oh yeah, I know.
So these days it is very common now for people not to go out until 10 or 11 o'clock at night and spend the whole night out, but the evening doesn't start until way after Doctor Who's finished. So I think by doing it on a Friday anyway, you potentially are opening it up to an audience who might watch Doctor Who before they go out, and then they can have the conversation that they would have had on Twitter, or even if they've already had it on Twitter, in person afterwards. So I think that feeds into that too.
What time would you be scheduling it though on those days? Because I think it's
one show is 7 till 7:30.
Yeah.
I think the BBC can rest the one show for 8 Friday evenings. The one show's on 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year. I'm quite sure the BBC can rest it for 8 Friday evenings in the spring, just once a week. It's still on 4 other nights a week. It's not killing anybody, but I think by having it on the Friday between the 23rd and the 25th of November, you get to find out how that plays a little bit.
Yeah, I think the option is 7:30 as well. Yeah, the Thursday night thing is you've got EastEnders in the way there as well, haven't you?
No, it's not about that, John. It's about the fact that there must not be school or work the next day, because anything that comes up the next day is the kind of thing that makes you put it off. It has to be broadcast, premiered, published, whatever you want to call it, at a time when you've got no obstacles to watching it immediately, if that's at your leisure. And so that's the entire point, is no work or school the next day, and give them 48 hours to catch it.
Because the other thing would be, for me, Disney Plus, when would they want it dropped as well? I would have thought they're going to want that there to drop on a Friday. Like you say, the exact reason you get the maximum views over the weekend.
Yes, but the Disney Star Wars series, and I don't think the Marvel series either drop at weekends. Yeah,
they drop Wednesdays or Thursdays. So yeah, Disney seems to like dropping their series towards the end of a week. I don't remember anything dropping earlier in the week off the top of my head.
I think the point with streaming is that you tend to get, it's about brand loyalty, isn't it?
Yes.
So Disney Plus is about brand loyalty. So their programs have lower audiences than BBC programs do, but more brand loyalty. So people go out of their way to watch those programs, whereas a large part of Doctor Who's audience is a fairly casual audience. And I think part of the Disney Plus thing is trying to bridge the gap between a casual audience and brand loyalty. And Doctor Who has a certain amount of inbuilt brand loyalty.
Yes.
I think the Disney Plus deal is about increasing the brand loyalty without denting the sort of casual audience. Hence, I think Friday night is that perfect meeting point of all those criteria. And the other reason why I think Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 23rd, 4th and 5th in November is possibly a go is that they've, in the magazine, said which director is for which special.
Yes.
So I think from behind the scenes, spoiler tag stuff, sort of on Twitter, social media, I think we'd established that Rachel Talalay was involved.
Yes.
Chania Button, is she called?
Chanja Button, yes.
And Tom Kingsley is the other one. I
Which
think
is an
we'd already.
interesting one because he's mostly known for a sitcom at the minute. So
Well, here's an interesting nugget for you then, John. Putting. So now I'm going to try and put 3 and 6 together and make 10. So
that sounds like a doctor numbering dilemma.
Yeah, but no, I'll come back to that slightly. So, but I think they've said Rachel Talalay is 1.
Yes.
Tom Kingsley is 2. Is it Tom Kingsley? It is, isn't it?
Tom Kingsley, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, and Chania Button is episode 3 of the 3 specials. And if you're going to do 3 specials and one of them is going to go out on the anniversary itself, do you do Tom Kingsley? Do you do Chania Button? Or do you do Rachel Talalay? So I think Rachel Talalay has got to be the anniversary itself. And therefore, I think the other 2 come afterwards. And therefore, I don't think it's going to be Thursday, 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 or Thursday, a Saturday, and then another Saturday, which spreads them out weirdly. I think it has to be Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 3 days in a trot, maximum impact, finishes on the weekend. So going back to what I was saying about all that catch up, people have got the weekend to binge Doctor Who if they didn't catch it live. Maximum impact. So I think it has to be Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Rachel Talalay on the anniversary itself. Going back to what you're saying about Tom Kingsley, and he comes from Ghosts.
Yep.
And things like that. So according to what we gathered, and I didn't go out of my way to catch this stuff, and I tried not to take too much of it in when I did catch some of this stuff, because I don't really want to know too much. But from what I could tell, they filmed the middle episode first.
I think so. It's stuff that was indoors, isn't it? Yeah.
Entirely in studio or indoors. So that suggests that that one's going to be slightly more sitcom-y, soap opera-y, indoorsy, kind of people focused, rather than necessarily special effects or, you know, production design or location focused. So I think the Tom Kingsley one is slightly more the people-y story of the 3. Yeah. Whereas obviously the Rachel Talalay is going to be sort of visual impact episode if it's the first one, and the Chania Button is going to be the kind of rounding stuff out, so potentially the more sort of dramatic of the 3 episodes.
Yeah, I mean, she directed the Neil Patrick Harris episode, didn't she? If I'm right. Yes. So yeah, that's going to be a big spectacle, and I would imagine if you're bringing, you know, someone with a name, you know, particularly for a level above Doctor Who as it stood, then
slight spoilers here. So I'm going to mention something slightly spoilery. So fingers in ears, because I'm going to keep this brief and I'm not going to delve too much into it. In fact, I'm going to do it without spoiling at all. So stuff to do with the character that Neil Patrick Harris plays in the 3rd episode was also seen on the set designs of stuff that was made for the 1st episode, insofar as people can tell. So even if the 3 episodes form 3 separate stories, there's going to be at least some tying up between the 3 episodes.
Absolutely. That's what I was kind of assuming that, because I think the underlying mystery will be, why has the Doctor got David Tennant's base again?
For sure, and presumably the Neil Patrick Harris character will tie in with an explanation for that. Right, I want to talk about how many episodes, because we think we know, and I want to talk about the sort of frequency, because that's also tied in with this conversation and maybe tied in with the Disney deal as well. But before we do that, I also want to talk about the comic strip in Doctor Who magazine, because there's this weird situation, and clearly this was meant to be cute, but I think if you're not an avid comic strip reader, this actually comes across as a really weird decision and sort of slightly self-defeating in some ways. So the story immediately after the regeneration carries on in the comic strip, and the TV program is going to take it up at some future point.
Yeah, I didn't get. I could understand when they did the TARDIS cutaway for Children in Need.
Yeah,
that's entirely understandable, and it's
seen by millions of people on television.
Exactly that. It's maximum exposure, but this, you're kind of going, really? Why?
And then the magazine strip, which we both read before we sat down to record this, in no way tells you anything about the character. It doesn't even raise the question of why. So the television episode ends with the Doctor utterly baffled as to what's just happened to him, and then he starts the comic strip as if nothing's happened at all, and he's just going into an adventure, right?
Yeah, and I'm assuming it's going to be a similar thing to the Christmas Invasion, where the TARDIS cutaway is a nice extra bit to have.
But it's inessential, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Because if I remember right, it's still the BBC policy, I think, still in their charter, that
Absolutely, yeah.
you can't have anything that essential to understand the story in spin-off media. You know, the BBC obviously doesn't publish Doctor Who magazine, so
the weird thing about this is that it can't address any of that.
no.
But by the same token, when the television program comes back, in order not to sort of nullify any of this stuff that's happened in the meantime, when the television program has to come back, it has to be a sort of at least fairly seasoned version of this new 14th Doctor. So it can't be a Doctor that's carrying on the conversation of what the hell happened to me. So it has to be a Doctor who's had a few adventures, and then the question of what happened to him catches up with him, which seems like a really and yeah, I get that there's sort of a year between the broadcast of the two episodes, 13 months between the broadcast of the two episodes, exactly 13 months between the broadcast of the two episodes. Actually, I get that there's that amount of time will have elapsed, but for most people watching it, the question of, well, what the hell is going on here, and the Doctor is asking what the hell's going on here too, is still probably going to factor into their expectations for the episode. So for it just to be catching up with him as opposed to something that he's sort of proactively trying to work out just seems like a slightly weird decision.
Yeah, Russell, I think, will, again, if you read the writer's tale, he's thinking in terms of what the audience will stand for, what it will look at. So there will not be anything to confuse him. There won't be any mention of the monsters in the current comic strip, which we won't mention for spoilers' sake.
Yeah, sure.
So it's going to be an entry point where you can carry, as I say, where you can carry straight on from that. There's no way he doesn't.
No, for sure it will be, but it's just, yeah, it has to come. See, with the Christmas Invasion, you didn't need the sort of the cutaway bit. That just gave you a bit more sort of background. But the Christmas Invasion basically still comes in at exactly the same place as the previous episode went out, and that was, the better part of 6 months. So it's not like a year, especially in these days when there's so much streaming and so much availability for repeat watching. I mean, not a large part of the audience, but certainly a fairly substantial number will probably rewatch The Power of the Doctor before the next one comes on. Did you see the iPlayer figures that were out?
I haven't had a look at them yet.
There's some iPlayer figures been published in the last few days, and Doctor Who was the 9th most streamed program on the iPlayer. I can't remember, was it 11 million streams on the iPlayer in a 3-month period that didn't even include any new episodes?
That's impressive, genuinely impressive.
I can't remember if it is 11 million. Maybe I'm overstating that. The point was, yeah, I think it was 11 million, because I think the point was somebody worked it out and they said, well, that means essentially that if you average it out, and of course it doesn't work like this, but if you average out across the entire series, something like 250,000 people have watched every series of Doctor Who in a 3-month period. No, in a 12, if you average that across a year, in a 12-month period, 250,000 people will have watched every series of Doctor Who, regardless of the fact that it's not new. So the back catalogue. So that is. So the point I'm making there is these old ideas of, if you take a year away, or if the audience for Jodie Whittaker's episode is 5 million on a consolidated 7 days, it's probably 10 million by the time we get to the next episode, and probably a lot of those people have only watched it fairly recently to the next episode too. My point being, all the old ideas of how people watch television and what matters to a television audience have changed, and what we have to do is, not what we have to do, but what television makers have to do, is adapt to the way audiences watch television.
Yeah, I mean, particularly with the way the BBC measure their audiences, and in fact, the UK, it's gone to 30 days, hasn't it? I think there's much less.
28, yeah.
Yeah, 28. There's much less emphasis on that big first night thing. It, they're much companies are much more aware that there's a long tail for this. You can have Doctor Who's this cash cow which will keep going on and on and on for gosh, it could go off probably beyond our lifetimes the way it goes.
Well, that's it. And as far as the Disney Plus deal goes, you have to assume that Disney Plus would want to, as Doctor Who's contracts for screenings and streaming come to an end in various different countries around the world, you have to assume that Disney Plus would want to fold in the back catalogue. When, of course, the back catalogue of classic Doctor Who is going to be disappearing probably off BritBox at some point soon when ITV fully take over. And, we all believe that the BBC are preparing to pull out of BritBox and take a lot of its stuff off. I think that's really interesting for two reasons. One, when Disney Plus opened, one of the things they wanted to do was get all the old Marvel series on there. And some of those Marvel series are pretty creaky as old Doctor Who.
Oh God,
I think classic Doctor Who would sit really well in the back catalogue on Disney Plus. So I wonder if there's some possibility that the back catalogue of the classic series might end up on Disney Plus too.
Well, bear in mind, Disney Plus has all the Disney animation back to Steamboat Willie on it, and that is creaky as you like.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So they're not beyond, a statement of it might have been made however many years ago. It might be different production standards, but people will watch it, and that's what they're after. Because
and when you go into the Doctor Who hub, when you go into the Doctor Who hub, with my youngster, I've watched a few of the old William Hartnells, and he was absolutely transfixed. So kids, they'll watch it if you put it in front of them. If you put a Doctor Who button on the Disney Hub thing, people are going to go out and they're going to discover Hartnell and Pertwee and McCoy and all the rest. If you put it in front of them, they'll watch it.
Yeah, you underestimate what an audience will not put up, but it's an audience that will have gone looking for Doctor Who. They will be quite happy to engage to make allowances.
Yeah, absolutely.
For those different storytelling standards.
Right, a couple of other things then. The frequency. I think it was widely believed that Chris Chibnall's version of Doctor Who was intended, at least initially, to go back to an annual thing, but for whatever reason they weren't able to do that. So I mean, we'll never know for sure if that was the case, because I don't think anybody's ever going to actually state it outright. So we've got to assume, especially given now Disney Plus's involvement, and let's be honest though, Mandalorian's third series is 3 years after its first series, so that's an average of 18 months between series, which is what Doctor Who's been doing. So this is by no means nailed in, but we think Russell T Davies is going to go back to annual. It's been heavily suggested that it's going to be 8 episodes plus a special each year. One of the things I heard was that Russell T Davies was writing all the 8 in the first series.
I've heard that, yeah.
Now, somebody said it was confirmed in the Scott Hancock column in here that there was a guest writer for episode 3. I gotta say, actually, I read it just before we started and I didn't notice that it was there. Even if it is, I wonder if there's a situation, and maybe this rumor may be a misreading of the situation, but with Chris Chibnall, sometimes you get his name. With Russell T Davies, you did a couple of times, and with Stephen Moffat, you did fairly frequently too. I wonder if actually the 8 episodes, maybe 4 of them will be completely written by Russell T Davies, and the other 4 will carry Russell T Davies and credits instead.
Possibly. I thought the situation, and this is based on knowledge, I thought the situation with Russell would be writing the first series, and then we'd see essentially guest writers for the second. That was where I thought you were going with it, but
that was what I thought too. Yeah, but it seems like people are saying that there's a guest writer for episode 3 of Ncuti Gatwa's first series, so it's clearly not the situation that we thought it was. And there's no suggestion of what way this might fall yet. There's been nothing said, but do you expect it to be a more self-contained 8-episode story, especially since 8 is quite a fair fewer than 13, so there's less. You have to spin it, fewer episodes you have to spin it out for. Do you think it'll be one story, but kind of a diversifying story like Flux?
I would expect it to be a similar kind of model to Russell's first series, where you've got it across the season, but you've got room for episodes, if there are production problems, to slip back and forth. So I don't expect it to be.
Having said that, just on that point,
Oh yeah,
because it's Bad Wolf, maybe not because it's Bad Wolf, but certainly Bad Wolf's a factor. They're making it so far ahead of time. I don't think that's a factor anymore.
probably not, but it could depend on the effects work you need for an episode. We don't know how much production is going to go into them. But yeah, definitely, I think that kind of 8 episode model would be, yeah, I think Russell isn't going to tell an 8 episode story across 8 episodes, because Miracle Day didn't particularly go well. For
Having said that, though, everything Russell T Davies has done since Miracle Day has been essentially one story across however many episodes.
But
so
then that was the case before as well, before Doctor Who.
Sort of, not entirely. I mean, Queer as Folk started that way, but then kind of devolved a bit. And The Grand was kind of story of the week, with a sort of background story going on.
Russell wasn't particularly in control on that, was he, though?
I don't know. Yeah, he wrote the whole thing. So, I mean, he wrote all 8 episodes of both series. Oh, maybe, no, but it's certainly the first series.
It's not. I think since he's been working for Red and the independent production companies, that he's been tended to tell that full story.
Yeah, so I've got to say again, like what I was talking about earlier, where I said it could go either way. I still think this could go either way. I don't know which I suspect. I don't know which I expect more.
I think the lower episode count, though, is simply to get Doctor Who back on an annual production basis, because because I think that 13, 12 episode things, it would drive you insane. Trying to get that every year.
And of course, it may just be coincidence, but the Disney model has been essentially for about 8 episodes. I think one of the Mandalorians came in at 7, and Andor's actually 12, isn't it?
I can't remember. Yeah,
I think Andor's 12, but I think they were trying. I've not seen any of Andor yet. I will catch up with it one day. But I think Andor's been trying to tell. I think Andor's been trying to tell a story that's a bit more like a longer length novel rather than a sort of fairly brisk read, which is more the sort of Mandalorian in that is more like a brisk read.
Yes.
Sort of form an analogy around it.
It's kind of from what I said, 3 or 4 interconnected stories. Andor, isn't it? I haven't got to the end yet.
Is it? So no, I don't know.
believe so, but I'll have to finish watching it. Get the family down.
So they said Ncuti Gatwa debuts at Christmas. So there's only going to be, well, seasonally.
Was it festive season, wasn't it? Yeah.
Festive season, is that what they said? So it could be Christmas Day, could be New Year's Day. Do you know what I suspect? Actually, Christmas Eve, for all the same reasons that I gave for Fridays. I think Christmas, because also I think.
But then you've got Christmas Day. We'll always have Boxing Day afterwards.
Oh, absolutely. But I think if you do it Christmas Eve, it gives you 48 hours as opposed to 24. And for all the reasons that I said you should do it on a Friday rather than a Saturday, I think that holds for Christmas too. But I think what I'm saying is we had Saturdays and Christmas Day. Then it moved to Sundays and New Year's Day. So both of those things moved and shifted back. Now I can see a situation where both of those things will move again and will both shift forwards. So Saturdays becomes Sundays, then becomes Fridays. Christmas Day becomes New Year's Day, and then becomes Christmas Eve. I don't know. I can just see it happening.
The other thing is, at the time of year it goes out, I think Russell will want to avoid Strictly, because I think Russell will want a fixed time slot as much as possible, because he knows the value of that.
And you're probably more likely to get that on Christmas Eve then rather than Christmas Day, aren't you?
Probably. But I know Christmas Day ratings are a lot lower than they used to be. So I don't know how Christmas Eve's been holding up on that. What's the point of maximum exposure is your question.
Yeah, and also, but also, like I say, maximum exposure. Also, because these days, if you look at the adverts that the BBC run for their programs, you'll see more adverts for programs that have already happened, with directing you towards the iPlayer than you will for
Yes.
programs that are coming up. So I've seen more trailers for Doctor Who since it was on, telling people you can go and watch it right now on iPlayer than I
Yeah, although
saw.
there's the BBC Three series as well that I've just seen a load of trailers for.
Well, and this goes back for years. I've been saying this. Tell people that something's available when it's available. Don't tell them it's coming up because they can't do anything about that except forget it. It's useless information until it's actually published. Then tell them it's there and they can go. If you tell somebody, buy this book, buy this DVD, here's a link, and you can spend your money now, then people will say, oh, that's exciting, and they'll spend their money. You tell people, here's a DVD, it's out in 4 weeks, spend your money on that. They'll go, oh yeah, I quite like that. And in that 4 weeks, you've got lots and lots and lots of opportunity to get excited by something else that you can
Yep.
spend the money on, and you've got no money. And sort of the point I'm making is all these adverts directing people to the iPlayer for programs that they can watch there and then. There's got to be a reason the BBC is more heavily investing in that in terms of their schedule, because they're getting results from it. Doctor Who, going back to it, was it 11 million views in 3 months when there wasn't even a new episode? That's because people are being directed to the iPlayer to catch up with the back catalogue. That's how people do it these days.
Yeah, again, it's a case of I know from when my wife briefly worked at BBC, they're very much trying to keep up with modern viewing habits. And for all the fact, fans will tend to declaim with authority about ratings. We've all done it in the past, and I'm sure we'll probably do it at some point in the future. People in the industry look at it in an entirely different way, whether that's right or wrong. And again, put it in front of the eyeballs.
Exactly. Right, I think we're just about done. There's a couple of quotes I wanted to bring up, and there's a couple of things that I think are slightly negative, so I don't know whether to do those or not, actually. Maybe we will, because we're getting to the end and people are probably turned
Yeah.
off by now anyway, right? Okay, so here's a slight subject. Is Ncuti Gatwa the 15th Doctor? Is David Tennant the 14th Doctor?
Yes, because Russell T Davies has said so.
Oh yes, but Russell T Davies says
I
so
know
many things.
I know he lies, but
Not only does he lie, but Ncuti Gatwa was announced months and months and months ago, and for that entire period, we've been calling him the 14th Doctor. And the BBC, not Russell T Davies, but the BBC have repeated the notion that he's the 14th Doctor in news reports and so forth, and they've not been corrected by Bad Wolf, they've not been corrected by Russell T Davies, they've not been corrected by the production office. And then suddenly we find out that David Tennant's going to be there, and we're calling Ncuti Gatwa the 15th Doctor, which is by way of saying that if you get those 3 David Tennant specials, and then we're told to disregard the numbering for David Tennant and go back to calling Ncuti Gatwa the 14th, and the whole 15th thing was a ruse because of the story that they're telling with David Tennant, nobody's going to really care, and it's not going to be that difficult.
no,
So
again, I think Russell will be thinking of the non-fan audience with that, which will be obviously the bigger audience. It's what will keep them, what will tell the story to them in the most straightforward way. Just say Tennant's
no, John.
14th. I know he's done this in DWM.
Oh,
But he called
no. This is why I think it's happened, because he wants the audience of general public at large. See, I don't think this is a fan consideration. I think he wants the audience, the general public at large, to go into the David Tennant specials thinking Tennant's the proper, true 14th Doctor and Ncuti Gatwa was the 15th, then to tell a story that pulls the rug out from under the general public and get to the end of that story. And I don't think it's going to be that David Tennant's Doctor is not a Doctor. I think he's going to be a Doctor.
Yes.
But I think, and it may be that it beds in anyway, and we end up calling Ncuti Gatwa the 15th anyway. But to me, it looks to me like the idea is let people think that Ncuti Gatwa was the 15th, so we can tell this weird story about this 14th Doctor that ultimately becomes like the fugitive Doctor and the War Doctor, an unnumbered Doctor who's a kind of extra Doctor, an interim Doctor, to the straightforward, ongoing, current incumbent Doctors that we have.
But honestly, I don't think the public really gives a monkeys about the numbering of the Doctors. That I think that again is the fact.
But that's why I think they can do it, because they don't give a monkeys about the numbering, so they're not going to care if it changes again.
Yeah,
the general public have been calling Shooty the 14th for the last 9 months. Now they're going to call him the 15th.
Did Russell didn't say he was the 14th, or did he himself?
I don't think so. And in fact, I think the press release has been doctored.
Appropriately.
Weirdly, I don't know if this is true. I swear that when the press release about David Tennant that came out immediately after the broadcast of The Power of the Doctor came out, I swear that press release said David Tennant's the next Doctor and the Shooty Cat was the 15th. And because I deliberately looked for that. I wanted to see if they used the word 14th in conjunction with Tennant, because I thought that it was an important point that if they didn't, that might say something about what the Tennant specials would be. So I looked for that, and I went to the BBC Media Centre and read the press release, and there was no mention of the word 14th. Now, yesterday, I went back to the BBC Media Centre and reread the press release, and it does say David Tennant's the 14th in a sentence that now has the number 15th almost immediately afterwards in a really clumsy fashion that was never the original wording on that press release. So it's like this. So I could be completely wrong. Maybe I'm misremembering, or maybe I saw one press release and the one that I went back and looked at is not the same press release at all. But it just looked like a really clumsy bit of doctoring that somebody's done. I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah. Are we going to talk about the regeneration costume? Because this has become a thing now. Russell T Davies has made this a thing. It's being talked about on like Gallifrey Base, and they're saying, well, nobody else cares. And then I went on Twitter immediately.
Oh, it's all over. Yes.
Yeah, to find people putting together photoshops of David Tennant in Jodie Whittaker's costume, right? So this is a thing. So are we going to mention it? We have to, really.
I think, yeah. I mean, I think what Russell T Davies has done, he's made that decision and he's set his logic out absolutely clearly.
I don't think that's his logic. I think that's an excuse. I think he made that decision based on the idea of David Tennant will look silly wearing Jodie Whittaker's costume, and he's made the logic up afterwards because that logic.
But that's what the logic is, essentially.
But the logic doesn't fit with the visual image. He says all this stuff about trans people and about newspapers picking up on David Tennant in women's clothes. That is an entirely androgynous costume. It's a t-shirt and a jacket, and you didn't even need to show his feet. I mean, the costume would have been resized for Tennant anyway, right? So the shortness of the trousers, you didn't even need to show the feet. And then if the next special comes in sort of like 3 months later in the Doctor's life, he's not going to be in that costume still anymore anyway. He just need. And here's the thing, I went online and I looked, and okay, this makes me sound like a, but because one of the things I thought was it might not be woman's clothes, but it's cut for a woman.
Yes.
So I went online and I looked, and the cut of the t-shirt changes in The Power of the Doctor. The Power of the Doctor has got a t-shirt in a different design. The design on the front is still the same, but the actual physical design of the shape of the t-shirt has changed
to fit Sacha Dhawan's.
Yes, but Jodie Whittaker's still wearing it, and therefore David Tennant would have still worn it. So it is a man's t-shirt in The Power of the Doctor. So there would have been no issue with David Tennant wearing that t-shirt in the regeneration scene at the end.
I still think it's a build issue as well. David Tennant is a bigger man than Sacha Dhawan is, but
you resized the costume. That's what they always did. That's what they did with Peter Capaldi's when Jodie Whittaker had to wear it. Jodie Whittaker didn't climb into the clothes that Peter Capaldi had. She had a version of his costume made for her.
It's difficult because, again, with the comic strip feeding in here, it's a case of, you know, I think they were going to start the next special, and always going to start the next special with David Tennant in this costume. So it's it's a narrative cut, which will form part of the story. I think.
Yes, if it had been part of the story, but it sounds to me like
And
he's trying to make out it's not part of the story and
I
excuse
think
it some other way.
And I think the other thing as well is Ncuti Gatwa is wearing this. It's at least the same tie as Tennant is wearing.
Oh, Ncuti Gatwa, the bit we saw with Ncuti
Yeah,
Gatwa is immediately post regeneration. I'm 100% convinced of that.
I'm pretty sure. And the only other thing it could be is if one of the internal doctor things that we saw with the Guardians of the Edge. That's the only other thing it could be if he's trapped somewhere. But yeah, I think it's only going to be minimal because again, Ncuti Gatwa was filming other things, so I don't think we're going to get much more than 1 or 2 scenes tops.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't think there's going to be much, and I think it's probably going to be a post regeneration thing. Maybe we'll get slightly more post regeneration, but I don't think RTD shoots his bolt and has too much Ncuti Gatwa in the specials, because then people aren't going to be as drawn back at Christmas to see what he's going to be like.
No, he's publicising that. I mean, again, I think the Tennant coming back thing works brilliantly because you've got this is what you used to love, and then you go straight into here's the new stuff, which you're going to love equally as much. I think it's a brilliant
it's
TV
an anniversary
move. Yeah, totally.
And of course it's completely an accident of timing. I've said this before, but Jodie Whittaker left immediately prior to the 60th anniversary, Jodie Whittaker and Chris Chibnall. So then you can't just have the 60th anniversary be the first episode of the next Doctor, because that's not what an anniversary does. An anniversary is about taking stock of everything that you've done thus far. So the only way to take stock is to look backwards. Chris Chibnall's just done an episode where you've got all these past Doctors and companions and stuff, all these nods to the past because of the centenary.
Yes.
So the centenary again was about taking stock and about looking backwards. So Russell T Davies has to find a new way of taking stock and looking backwards. And David Tennant and Catherine Tate landed something in his lap that was absolutely perfect. So the timing couldn't have been better. Tennant and Tate say, we'd like to come back and do a few more episodes. Russell T Davies is scratching his head and thinking, I need to do something for the anniversary. Bingo. Hey presto. Timing worked out perfectly.
It's and you're talking, it is pretty much in ratings terms, certainly the most popular era Doctor Who there's ever been, because I think was it something like from Turn Left through to the 11th Hour, everything is in the top 5 of the week.
Yeah, but that's not ratings terms, that's charting terms. Because rating and charting, as we've discussed, rating changes. But in terms of the chart, Doctor Who is, in a classic series run, I think one episode in the entire run made the top 5.
Was it The Ark in Space or something like that?
I think one of the episodes of The Ark in Space did, yeah. In the modern era, you've had a lot of episodes in the top 10 and a fair few in the top 5, and 2 in a row got to number 1, and they were both Tennant. One of them was Tennant and Tate, and was it 2 in a row? No, I can't remember now.
I think the only reason that The End of Time wasn't in number 1 was that it was split across the BBC HD channel and the BBC.
Oh yeah,
so the BBC cost themselves it.
Yeah. Yes. So yes. But on that subject about Russell T Davies doing the anniversary, here's something really interesting that's in his interview. Did you see the bit where he talks about Tennant and Tate giving him the idea?
I haven't read that bit yet, but I've heard it talked about.
Well, this is really interesting. I think this is really interesting because I think the behind the scenes story of what's going, because this is unprecedented for somebody who used to be showrunner on Doctor Who to come back and be the main showrunner again. And I'm including the classic series.
Well, Barry Letts, exact, wasn't it? Yeah,
exact. But he wasn't the main producer. He wasn't deciding what the stories were going to be. Russell T Davies has come back to write and decide what the stories are going to be. That's unprecedented. And I think the reasoning behind that is, well, I find it fascinating. And I'm on the record, I'm pretty sure I said this on the podcast or somewhere else at least, on the record as believing that the chain of events, to my mind, was most likely Bad Wolf, Tranter and Gardner, who had been making Doctor Who now in charge of an independent production company, knowing that the BBC are going to have to start putting programmes out to tender. I think Tranter and Gardner put together a plan to get Doctor Who. And their plan is get Davis, because we all worked so well together before, and go to the BBC with Davis and say to the BBC, we want to make Doctor Who. Here's Russell T Davis. What do you say to that? I think, there's no way to prove it. And, I could be wrong, but I think that to me sounds like the most likely chain of events, because that's an independent production company being proactive about something. Whereas the BBC, for all the, there are lots of different people in the BBC are putting out programs week after week, day after day, hour after hour. And so their mindset is on a train of programming.
Yes.
Whereas an independent production company, they're not on a train of programming. They're constantly looking for the next project. So they have a very different way of looking at projects, to be looking at what the next project could be. So they're proactively looking for things to do. So I think, to me, it just suggests that the proactive part of this partnership was Bad Wolf coming to the BBC. Now, the Russell T Davies thing throws a bit of a spanner into that theory, because the way he puts it, Tennant and Tate came to him and he wasn't even going to be making Doctor Who. He comes back to make Doctor Who because they say that.
Because they go, why aren't we doing this again? This was the most fun we had in our lives.
Exactly. It's not quite that, but yeah, it's certainly down that line.
I certainly would say that the key factor in coming back is Piers Wenger sees Russell T Davies wants to come back and work on Doctor Who. Snap your hand off. That's the important bit.
But I wonder, so I've simplified things very much in the last couple of minutes. I wonder if actually the story's perhaps fairly similar to what I've outlined, but with slight differences. Maybe what puts the idea in Davis and Gardner and Tranter's minds is this suggestion from Tennant and Tate, we'd like to do Doctor Who again. Let's go to the BBC. And in fact, I said on this podcast, and I think Matt poo-pooed it, what if Jane Tranter and Julie Gardner go to the BBC and say, hey, not only have we got Russell T Davies, we've got David Tennant and Catherine Tate too. The BBC is never going to say no to that. Now, according to this interview, that very much looks like that's exactly what did happen. So maybe Tennant and Tate say to Davis, we'd like to do Doctor Who. And Davis goes, yeah. And then goes, yeah. And then goes to Julie Gardner and Jane Tranter, because they speak all the time. They're the best of friends. And says, hey, David Tennant and Catherine Tate have said, they'd like to do some more Doctor Who. That would be fun, wouldn't it? And Julie Gardner goes, yes, that would be fun. Count me in. Do you know what I mean?
And and let's face it, if you can get your hands on a known property like Doctor Who as an independent production company, you snap the hands off.
Exactly. So I suspect again that it's not the BBC going to them, but it's them going to the BBC. I think this interview it doesn't confirm it exactly, but it certainly gives some weight to that suggestion. But the reason I'm bringing it up, and Russell T Davies tries to make light of this in the interview, but what Russell T Davies essentially says in the interview is, they came up with this idea for me to come back and make Doctor Who. So instead of bringing this subject up with Chris Chibnall and finding out when and whether there might be a free spot for us to do this, I ignored Chris Chibnall completely, went behind his back, went to Piers Wenger and said, I want to come back and make Doctor Who. And he basically says that as boldly as that.
It does very much look that way, yes.
No, he says it outright that's what he did. He tries to phrase it, I didn't want to bother Chris Chibnall with it because I know how busy he is and he doesn't want to talk to me about Doctor Who. But seriously, Russell T Davies went behind his back to make this Doctor Who. Now, insofar as timing's concerned, I think the timing has worked out well for everybody. But I did read that, and Russell T Davies has proved in the past that as big and as bubbly a man as he is also savage when it comes to getting his own way. If he wants something, he is savage about going
Ruthless.
out and getting
Yeah.
that thing. Yeah, ruthless and brutal. And I think this is Russell T Davies making light of a piece of absolutely ruthless, brutal television politics that he's been involved in.
I suspect it's going to be something like Chris Chibnall coming to the end of his contract and it not being renewed is going to be the fundamental issue.
Chibnall said at the start, he didn't go on record as saying this, but he said this to somebody, and that person went on record in a Chris Chibnall interview and said this. So it was said with Chibnall's blessing, but Chibnall said he had a 5-year plan, and he has done that 5-year plan. So Chris Chibnall was, I think, always going to leave at this point, regardless.
Roughly, I would imagine, yes. Yeah. But again, we don't know how much any 5-year plan was disrupted by, obviously, COVID and other circumstances.
For sure. And we'll do another episode, perhaps a couple, on Jodie Whittaker before the end of the year or early next, when I want to talk about my theories about what the Jodie Whittaker era is really all about. Because I'm pretty sure, actually, there's a theme that runs through that that's quite a sort of substantial, sort of philosophical theme that runs through that era that I don't think's really been noticed or talked about. And I'm pretty sure it's there, because actually once I I've been thinking about it, and it's there through quite a fair bit of the run. We'll talk about that. But I just, maybe I'll put it to you off the air, but I want to save it for when we do the subjects, because I don't want to look. We've been going for an hour and 21 minutes.
I know.
Very final thought then. In that interview in Doctor Who magazine, Russell T Davies describes describes David Tennant as, quote, unashamedly the 14th Doctor. So, in other words, he is the 14th Doctor. He's not the 14th Doctor. And also he uses the word unashamedly. Now, Russell T Davies doesn't use words that he hasn't fully thought through the meaning of, or at least I wouldn't have expected him to. Certainly not like that.
Does use a lot of hyperbole, though.
No, but the point is unashamedly. So it's not that he's saying marvellously the 14th Doctor or absolutely the 14th Doctor. He's saying he's the 14th Doctor and there's no shame about it. In other words, I believe in that statement he's addressing the idea that after the first woman Doctor, he's gone back to the straight white male. Obviously with Ncuti Gatwa in the wings, and that's why Ncuti Gatwa was announced before David Tennant, because They didn't need to, but they wanted to put it on record that it wasn't going to be David Tennant without it being something else afterwards. So I think they were very careful about how they announced those things. But yeah, I think Russell T Davies is trying to sort of offset that criticism in his choice of words there, unashamedly the 14th. But here's the reason why I brought that quote up, because elsewhere in that interview, he's talking about the amount of lies you tell as a showrunner in order to promote your program, in order to get your audience thinking about one thing when you're going to do something else. In other words, and I think maybe the context of this was, we tell them that Ncuti Gatwa was the next Doctor, so that when Jodie Whittaker regenerates into David Tennant, it's a surprise. Well, dear reader, there are going to be other surprises. And the big quote I took out of that interview, he says, no, it's not in the interview, it's in the production notes. He says in the production notes, quote, reader, is anything ever true? Unquote. And the context being, is anything I ever tell you or any other showrunner ever tells you going to be as true as you think it is, or is there going to be something else about it? And that's the thing. Everything that we've seen and heard from Russell T Davies over the last 2.5 weeks and over the last several months might or might not be as true on the face of it as it appears, or it might have a different meaning.
Just get the eyeballs on the show. That's all he wants, I think.
So until we do this again, I was JR.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.